Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, the place where every cold case, chilling crime, and unsolved mystery is brought back to life. From vanished persons to twisted betrayals, we dig deep into the unknown to uncover the truth that others left buried. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us which city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far the mystery travels. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a case. Because here, some truths are only heard in the dead quiet. Hercule Poirot and the Painter's Children. Chapter 1. The Portrait of Foreboding. Maurice Leclerc stood bathed in the dim light of early morning, a paintbrush balanced delicately between his fingers. Outside, a thin mist curled around the solitary oak in his garden, but Maurice's gaze was fixed on the blank canvas before him. Their modest home sat on the fringe of a quiet provincial town, bordered by open fields and gently rolling hills. Inside, the air always carried the faint scent of turpentine, paint thinner, and fresh oils. Canvases lined the walls, some half-realized, others only skeletal outlines of ideas not yet born. On this morning, however, a strange urgency stirred within him. His breath came fast, his mind swirled with fragmented visions. Though admired locally for his stirring landscapes, Maurice had been restless for weeks, haunted by vague, troubling imagery. His work was often described as emotional, expressive, but today his imagination veered into unfamiliar and darker terrain. He chose a fine-tipped brush and dipped it into a shade of crimson, darker than any he had used before. With rapid strokes, almost as if guided by some unseen force, he painted the outline of a woman lying motionless in a shadow-drenched room. Even the initial form sent a tremor through him. He layered the scene, earthy browns, dusky greys for the gloom, and a streak of pallid white to simulate moonlight. Then, as if compelled to complete the vision, he added the final chilling detail, a knife handle protruding from the woman's chest. An hour later, Clarice Leclerc found her husband at the easel. Petite and composed, Clarice wore an expression perpetually caught between scrutiny and disapproval. She too was a painter, though her art favored precision and symmetry, where Maurice leaned into instinct and emotion. "Mon Dieu," she gasped, eyes locked on the canvas. "Maurice, what are you painting?" He turned to her slowly, sweat glistening on his brow. He looked dazed, breathless, as though waking from a fevered dream. I don't know. It came to me, suddenly." Clarice's brow furrowed. She often found his impulses tiresome, but this disturbed her more deeply. "It's grotesque. Please, cover it at least. The children mustn't see something so horrible." Thomas and Viola, aged 12 and 10, were absent that morning, as they often were whenever chores or lessons loomed. Clarice's strict routines and harsh rules were frequently sidestepped by the siblings in favor of roaming the untamed fields nearby. She viewed their free-spiritedness as a flaw to be corrected. Maurice, in contrast, saw it as a flame worth preserving. Their opposing philosophies created a constant tension in the household, an unspoken war between order and imagination. That night, they dined in silence. The children ate quickly, casting cautious glances at their mother, whose mood had soured ever since she'd seen the painting. Maurice was quiet as well, caught between guilt and an unsettling fascination with what he had created. Clarice retired early, the children vanished to their rooms. Maurice lingered in the studio, staring into the lamplight's flickering shadows. The painted knife seemed to glint with unnatural intensity. By dawn, their fragile routine was shattered. A scream tore through the house. Viola, pale and shaking, stumbled into the hallway. Moments later, Thomas appeared, face stricken with disbelief. They had found their mother, lifeless, collapsed on the studio floor. A real knife pierced her chest, mirroring the exact image from Maurice's painting. Neighbors rushed in at the sound of the children's wails. The authorities were called. When police arrived, they found Maurice crouched beside his wife's body, his hands trembling. He muttered incoherently, I could never. yet the painting still stood on its easel, an exact replica of the scene before them. Constable Girard, a veteran officer, studied the painting with narrowed eyes. "Too precise," he murmured. "This wasn't chance. This was intent." Maurice swore he had nothing to do with her death. Yes, they had disagreements, but he had loved Clarisse. He would never harm her. Still, suspicion hung heavily in the air. When neighbours were interviewed, some recounted hearing the couple's arguments. Others described Clarisse's growing discomfort with her husband's disturbing creative impulses. No one had seen the crime, but the painting stood as a silent, damning witness. The children, still in shock, could provide no clear account of the night's events. Investigators discovered a paint-streaked knife matching the one in the painting. A chilling theory took root. Maurice had envisioned the murder, then brought it to life. In a matter of days, Maurice Leclerc stood trial, the courtroom gripped by the macabre tale of an artist who had seemingly predicted or committed his wife's murder through his art. He pleaded innocent, but the evidence, however circumstantial, was compelling. Forensic experts called the painting too deliberate. The children, too young and traumatized to testify effectively, could not defend him. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. As the gavel fell, silence swept the courtroom like a final breath. Maurice's face twisted with grief and disbelief. His children wept quietly in the back, huddled together, forever altered. The town, once proud of its brilliant artistic couple, was left with a different legacy, one not of inspiration, but of tragedy. A masterpiece, born of darkness, had become a prophecy fulfilled. Chapter 2. The Kiss of Death. Hercule Poirot was midway through a peaceful breakfast in his elegantly appointed London flat when a sharp rap at the door interrupted his morning ritual. Setting down his porcelain coffee cup with a faint sigh, he adjusted the lapels of his impeccably pressed jacket and strode across the polished parquet floor to greet his visitor. Chief Inspector Giles of Scotland Yard stood at the threshold, hat in hand, his face unusually pale and lined with worry. Without the customary pleasantries, he delivered the reason for his visit. A newlywed couple had been found murdered in their own home, their lips grotesquely sewn together, an eternal, silent kiss. Though Poirot had long since stepped away from official investigations, his name remained synonymous with unraveling the most perplexing and delicate of crimes. Giles knew where to turn when logic alone could not suffice. Poirot offered a subtle nod, excused himself to retrieve his overcoat and ornamental silver-handled cane, more a statement of style than necessity, and together they descended the stairs to hail a taxi amid the hum of early London traffic. Their destination? A modest terraced house in Bloomsbury, cordoned off by uniformed constables and watched by a small gathering of curious neighbours. The air was crisp, the sunlight thin and unforgiving, revealing every shadow in stark detail. Inside, the scene was suffocating with sorrow. A small sitting room, still decorated with wedding cards and a wilting bouquet, housed the two bodies, frozen in death, lips bound by thread, as though in some ghastly parody of romance. Giles led him forward. "Both were found like this," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the joined faces. "Lips sewn together, no signs of forced entry, just a note beside them. Happy wedding." He swallowed. "They were married yesterday?" Poirot's eyes darted across the room, taking in every detail with clinical detachment. He carefully lifted a small spool of thread from a nearby table, the label visible on its wooden frame. "Très intéressant," he murmured. "See how neat the work is. This is not the chaos of impulse, it is staged, deliberate. The killer is no stranger to a needle." He pointed to the rug near the couple. "No drag marks, no overturned furniture. The room is undisturbed. Either they knew the killer, or the act was so swift they had no chance to react." Giles nodded grimly. Their hands were interlaced, like they were made to pose. Poirot circled the scene slowly. The curtains were drawn, casting the room into a dim half-light despite the morning sun. A faint scratch on the floor, A chair set at an unnatural angle. Every detail suggested a choreographed tableau, not a crime of passion, but a message wrapped in horror. A coroner's assistant cleared his throat. Autopsy suggests no sedatives. They were likely awake at the time of death. Poirot stiffened. Then the killer forced this scene while they were conscious. He shook his head. This is not mere cruelty, it is artistry in the service of madness. He withdrew his notebook, making silent entries as his mind churned with suspicions. Each detail deepened the sense that this was not an isolated murder. This killer, he felt, was making a statement. Outside, away from the claustrophobic air of the death room, Poirot allowed himself a breath. "It is a performance," he said softly. A final kiss, stitched shut. A wedding turned into a funeral. Why target newlyweds? What is the meaning behind such theatrics? Giles frowned. They married yesterday in a small registry office. No enemies, no prior incidents, no one suspicious at the ceremony. Nothing fits. Poirot tapped his cane lightly on the pavement. But murder rarely follows logic at the outset. It is like a jigsaw puzzle, each piece meaningless alone, but together they form an image. I believe, my friend, that we are dealing with someone who does not kill out of anger, but out of vision. A killer who sees death as craft. Back in his flat, Poirot settled into his armchair, the city outside dimming into twilight. The case troubled him more than most. He had encountered killers of every kind, jealous, greedy, vengeful, but this felt different, stylized, symbolic. The stitched kiss was not just grotesque, it was intended to disturb. He turned the spool of thread over in his fingers, noting the brand again. Was it a clue, or a red herring left to be discovered? Was the killer taunting them, or guiding them? As London slipped into night, its streets still bustling with unaware citizens, Poirot sat in quiet contemplation. A dark new presence had crept into the city, clever, meticulous, and merciless. And in the stillness of his thoughts, Poirot knew with certainty this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Art of Terror. A strange hush had settled over the streets of London. It was not the usual quiet of a city in winter, but something heavier, an undercurrent of dread that clung to the air like fog. A week had passed since the murder of a newlywed couple, their lips grotesquely sewn together in a chilling parody of romance. And now, with another crime making headlines, that unease bloomed into full-blown fear. It was mid-afternoon when Hercule Poirot arrived at a modest house on the outskirts of Marylebone. A small crowd had gathered outside, murmuring in subdued tones, their eyes fixed on the front door, as if expecting death itself to emerge. Two constables held the spectators at bay. A brisk wind stirred the fallen leaves along the pavement, nature offering a quiet shudder in response to the horror inside. "Good afternoon, Inspector," Poirot said, as he stepped into the house, removing his hat with solemn grace. Inspector Giles, eyes tired and jaw set, greeted him with a curt nod. The detective's gaze drifted down the narrow hallway, noting a single, muddy footprint on the rug. Perhaps meaningful, perhaps not, but nothing escaped Poirot's eye. "This way," Giles said quietly, leading him toward the back sitting room. What should have been a cozy space, white curtains, floral wallpaper, warm light, had been transformed into a macabre stage. Another newlywed couple lay on the carpet, their bodies bound in a brutal embrace. Rope cut deep into their arms, forcing them together in a final pose of intimacy. Death had stolen their warmth, but the marks of fear lingered in their features. On the floor beside them lay a delicate note card. 2 words, "Love lives forever." Poirot approached in silence, eyes narrowing, as he examined the twine still embedded in the victim's skin. A coarse spool had been discarded nearby, almost proudly. His moustache twitched, a sign of intense concentration. This was no frenzied act. It was precise, intentional, a design executed with chilling finesse. "Exactly a week since the first murders," Giles said grimly. "Another couple," Another note. Same theme: love, union, permanence. The papers have taken to calling him the wedding killer. Poirot straightened, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve. So the killer has evolved. From sewing lips to binding limbs, different materials, same motif, an eternal union in death. One might almost say he is experimenting with methods. He turned, scanning the scene. There is no mess, no overturned furniture, no sign of struggle. It's a performance, every detail staged. London, meanwhile, responded with panic. Newspapers fed the frenzy with lurid headlines. Whispers filled cafes, offices, and church halls. Weddings were delayed, ceremonies downsized or cancelled entirely. Couples clung to crowds, hoping safety lay in numbers. Fear had seeped into the city's bones. Despite their efforts, Giles and Poirot uncovered no leads. They canvassed florists, dressmakers, tailors, anyone who might have served either couple. They traced suppliers of rope and thread, hoping for a specific origin. Nothing. The trail remained maddeningly clean, the killer meticulous in covering his tracks. During one late-night meeting in Poirot's flat, Giles sipped hot chocolate while flipping through autopsy reports and crime scene sketches. Poirot tapped a photo of the latest knotwork with his finger. "Note the precision," he said. "That rope is not randomly tied. See here? Symmetrical loops, evenly spaced tension. This is practiced. A sailor, perhaps, or someone skilled in a craft that demands control and balance." "We've checked marine supply stores," Giles replied, rubbing his forehead. "The rope's common, same as the thread. No exclusive source, no name, no face, just theatrics." Poirot's expression darkened. "Then we look beyond the materials, we look to the message." He paused. "Why newlyweds? Why these tokens of affection twisted into instruments of horror? Is it jealousy, a broken heart, or is it something far more abstract?" Giles sighed. "A vendetta against love itself?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. He stood, moving to the window. "I believe," he said finally, "that this killer sees himself not as a villain, but as an artist. These are not just murders, they are compositions, performances in a theatre of his own making, and his medium is intimacy turned grotesque." Outside, London's lights flickered under the gathering night. Inside Poirot's flat, the warmth of lamplight did little to soften the weight of the unsolved. The room was orderly, but something hung in the air, a quiet, coiled tension. Later, after Giles had departed, Poirot walked alone through his flat. His mind returned again and again to the imagery, the rope, the forced embrace, the note about eternal love. The killer wasn't just murdering, he was communicating. At the window, Poirot stared out over the city, now blanketed in darkness. Somewhere out there, the wedding killer planned his next move, his next scene. The horror, Poirot feared, was far from over. And until he uncovered the truth behind these twisted performances, no couple in London would rest easy. Chapter 4. The Boundaries of Love. A biting December wind swept over the abandoned railway yard at the city's fringe, its shrill whistle rattling the shattered panes of a forgotten depot. The last of the twilight bled from the sky, casting long shadows through the crumbling doorway as Hercule Poirot stepped inside. Dust motes swirled in the beam of his flashlight, floating in the stagnant air like silent witnesses. The air was thick with damp and decay, every breath heavy with unease. Inside, Inspector Giles stood stiffly with two constables flanking him. Their faces were pale, their expressions grim. On the floor lay the latest scene in what had become a string of increasingly macabre tableaux. Two young black men, lifeless and unnaturally joined. Their abdomens had been stitched together, the thread unmistakable, thick, grey, and identical to the one found at the previous murders. The stitching was precise, ritualistic. Poirot's steps echoed lightly as he entered, his eyes sharp beneath furrowed brows. He nodded once at Giles. There was no room for formalities. Horror left no space for civility. Pinned neatly to one man's sleeve was a handwritten note. The message written in the same elegant script as before, read, "Love is blind." But this time, something had shifted. "These men aren't married," Giles said, his voice low and uncertain. "No rings. No formal bond we know of. As far as we can tell, they weren't a couple either. But it's the same thread, same style, same theatrics." Poirot crouched beside the bodies, his gloved hands hovering over the stitches without touching. The thread pulled the two torsos tightly together, a grotesque echo of intimacy. The binding was exact, too neat, too methodical to be random. "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "This is the same hand, the same obsession, but the choice of victims, no, it breaks from the established pattern." Above them, a broken section of roof allowed narrow shafts of fading daylight to cut across the scene, illuminating the victims' still faces. Poirot studied every detail, the precision of the needlework, the serenity forced onto their expressions, the placement of the note. First sewn lips, then the rope-bound embrace, and now bodies literally fused, each murder a dark reimagining of closeness, of connection. And always the killer left behind a whisper of philosophy, a line, a message, a title to his twisted exhibit. "Love is blind," Poirot repeated softly. "This, mon ami, is no longer about marriage. It is about intimacy, perceived, distorted, redefined." Word spread quickly through the city, and the press descended on this new horror with eager frenzy. The wedding killer label now felt insufficient. These victims were not newlyweds and their connection remained unclear. Speculation surged. Was anyone safe now? Had the killer changed his focus or revealed his true one? Fear mushroomed in the public psyche. Families locked their doors earlier, couples kept closer, cafes, shops, and homes hummed with anxious conversation. If the first victims had been chosen for symbolic reasons, romantic, matrimonial, then what did this deviation mean? Was love itself the target, or connection of any kind? Poirot and Giles canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with those who lived near the derelict station. Most had little to offer, just faint recollections of voices in the night, or shadows slipping past broken fences. One woman claimed to see a man escorting two others into the building days before, but her description was vague and contradictory. The fear in her eyes, however, was unmistakable. Back at Poirot's flat that evening, a heavy silence fell over the small sitting room as Giles paced. Maps and photographs lay spread across the polished table. The crime scenes, each unique yet unified in theme, formed a grotesque gallery. Poirot, seated and sipping strong tea, studied the images intently. Sewn lips, bound limbs, now joined torsos. Every victim had been arranged, displayed, made into a symbol. "There is consistency?" Poirot said at last. "Not in the victims, perhaps, but in the message. This killer is creating a series. Each piece, another stroke in a larger composition." Giles rubbed the back of his neck, his voice tight with frustration. "But why these two men? Why not another married couple? What changed?" "Maybe nothing," Poirot replied. "Perhaps our mistake was in assuming the focus was on marriage. What if that was merely a motif, one interpretation of love? If the killer sees himself as an artist, or philosopher even, then his subject is not matrimony, but intimacy in all its forms, the kind that binds, the kind that blinds." Giles let out a slow breath. "Then anyone close to anyone could be a target." Poirot's silence confirmed it. In the following days, the investigation widened. Poirot walked through art galleries, visited used bookshops, and inquired discreetly at private salons known for curating tragic romance and fringe philosophy. He sought patterns not in criminal psychology, but in symbolism, in literature, in art. Could the killer be drawing inspiration from romantic archetypes, obsessive love, fatal unions? Though no single clue emerged, each thread added to Poirot's belief. These crimes were not born of passion or vengeance. They were designed, and design meant intention, planning, crescendo yet to come. London, meanwhile, simmered with dread. Public fear deepened, now no longer confined to lovers or the newly married. Rumours abounded. Some claimed to have seen a masked figure trailing couples. Others whispered of coded messages in the killer's notes. But beneath the noise, a darker certainty took hold. The killer was still watching, still choosing. Poirot, sitting once more in the glow of his quiet flat, stared at a row of crime scene photos lined on the mantel. His eyes lingered on the stitched torsos. The threads, so tightly wound, so methodical, seemed less like instruments of death and more like the killer's signature. "This is not madness," he said aloud, to no one. "This is belief." And belief, when paired with intelligence and obsession, could be a most dangerous thing. Chapter 5. Portraits of the Damned. Hercule Poirot emerged from the thick curtain of London fog, his footsteps crisp against the gleaming marble floor of the Stanton Gallery. Though the clock struck early afternoon, the filtered winter light cast a dim, museum-like gloom across the exhibition halls. Poirot, immaculate as ever, and sharp-eyed beneath his neat moustache, had come following a quiet tip from a trusted acquaintance in the art world. A new show, Shadowed Passions, had become the subject of hushed conversations in the cafes and salons of London, praised and whispered about in equal measure for its disturbing power. He moved through the first gallery space with casual grace, his gaze gliding over bold abstractions and melancholic landscapes. Most pieces lacked the edge that stirred Poirot's professional instinct. But as he passed into a smaller, quieter alcove tucked at the exhibit's rear, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Visitors spoke in lowered tones, their postures stiffened. Something unspoken lingered in the air. Poirot's eyes settled on 4 canvases, aligned in a chilling sequence. The first depicted a couple locked in a passionate kiss. Yet there was something unnatural in the way their hands clutched at each other. The brushstrokes were raw, almost frantic, giving the moment an edge of desperation rather than tenderness. Poirot's mind involuntarily jumped to the first murder, the young bride and groom with their lips sewn together in a grotesque imitation of a kiss. He stepped to the second canvas. A man and woman embraced, their bodies intertwined in a pose that suggested comfort, but also a haunting sorrow. The color palette leaned toward dusky blues and grays, evoking both intimacy and mourning. Poirot studied the placement of their limbs, the void-like background, and again felt a chill. The resemblance to the second crime, the newlyweds bound with rope in a forced, eternal embrace, was too precise to dismiss. Then came the third painting. 2 young black men lay side by side in repose, their expressions soft but somber, as though suspended in a moment beyond death. Muted browns and shadowed greys dominated the canvas. It was a clear visual echo of the third crime scene, the 2 men found stitched together, "Love is blind," scrawled on a note. The parallels were undeniable. The artist had captured the essence of each murder with uncanny fidelity. But it was the 4th canvas that made Poirot stop cold. This painting remained unfinished. The outline of a boy seated on the floor, a girl's head resting gently on his lap, loomed at the center. Their faces were incomplete, sketched in soft pencil lines. There were no defined eyes, no final brushstrokes to seal the image. Yet even in this rough form, the scene radiated a disturbing stillness, a moment suspended, intimate, quiet and threatening. It didn't depict a crime already committed, it felt like a prophecy. A soft voice at his side drew Poirot back from the image. "Striking, aren't they?" said a woman in a black beret, her tone strained despite her attempt at appreciation. She peered over half-moon glasses at the paintings, visibly unsettled. Another patron murmured agreement, but added that many found the works too disturbing for public display. Morbid, some critics had called them. Soon a gallery attendant approached, tall, refined, and cautious. Poirot greeted him with polite warmth, offering a simple business card. He refrained from using his reputation as leverage, relying instead on quiet confidence. He inquired about the artist behind these 4 dark canvases. The attendant hesitated briefly, then responded in a lowered voice, "Maurice Leclerc, sir." The pieces arrived just over 2 weeks ago. There's been considerable discussion. Leclerc. The name struck Poirot like a sudden chill. Maurice Leclerc had vanished from the public eye after a scandal 2 decades earlier, a murder that shook both the art world and the criminal courts. He had been convicted of killing his wife in a manner shockingly similar to a painting he'd completed months before. Though Poirot hadn't investigated the case himself, he recalled the whispers. An artist of rare talent, plagued by a turbulent personal life and a macabre imagination. The murder weapon had mirrored the one in his painting. The pose of the body had been duplicated precisely. And now, here were more paintings, each depicting recent murders that bore the killer's unmistakable signature. It didn't add up. Leclerc was reportedly still in prison. Poirot's mind raced. Could someone be replicating Leclerc's vision in real life? Or, more chilling still, could the artist be directing the killings from afar? He requested more information from the gallery attendant, how the works had arrived, who had authorized their display, and whether Leclerc himself had made any appearances. The answers were vague and unsatisfying. The paintings had been submitted through a private collector who claimed to represent Leclerc's interests. No personal visit from the artist. The curator had approved the display under the assumption the works were historical or reissued from Leclerc's earlier period. The benefactor remained anonymous. Poirot examined the printed catalogue of the exhibit. One essay praised Leclerc's emotional ferocity and intimate command of pain and beauty. Another acknowledged the controversy, referencing the blurred line between art and prophecy and the seductive horror of love turned fatal. These weren't just works of expression, they were psychological manifestos, and someone was using them as blueprints for murder. Poirot thanked the attendant and stepped back into the biting London air. The unfinished painting haunted him most of all. Unlike the others, it suggested an act not yet carried out, a final tableau waiting to be realized. If the pattern continued, another victim would soon appear, posed in that precise, sorrowful configuration. Seated in the back of a rattling black cab, Poirot's thoughts moved swiftly. The timeline, the names, the possibility that Leclerc, if not the hand behind the crimes, might at least be the mind. The killer wasn't improvising, he was following a script, and the last scene hadn't yet been staged. Chapter 6. Echoes Behind Bars. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, Hercule Poirot stepped into the bleak confines of Lime Bridge Prison. The cold institutional silence hung thick in the corridors, as though despair itself were part of the architecture. Iron gates loomed like sentinels, and the grey stone walls bore the weight of countless forgotten stories. Uniformed warders passed briskly, the clatter of their keys echoing dully as they moved, automated, indifferent. Poirot's refined appearance, from the crisp line of his suit to the shine of his patent shoes, seemed like an alien presence amid such grim surroundings. He was led to a small interview room, a stark, undecorated cell of conversation. A bolted-down table, 2 metal chairs, and a narrow window offering only a thin sliver of winter light. Poirot placed his hat gently on the table, his gloved finger brushing along its chipped edge. The silence was so absolute that the distant slam of a closing cell door rang out like a funeral bell. And then came the man he had come to meet. Maurice Leclerc entered slowly, thin and sunken-eyed, a man not so much aged as hollowed out. The prison uniform hung from his frame like borrowed skin. And yet, behind the pallor and stooped posture, there burned something sharp, an ember of intensity that flared the moment their eyes met. "Good morning, Monsieur Leclerc," Poirot said with a small, courteous bow. "I am Hercule Poirot. I believe you are aware of why I have requested this meeting." Leclerc lowered himself into the chair with a grace that belied his condition. He laced his fingers and rested them on the table. "I have heard things," he said, in a calm but worn voice. "Talk of murders, that they resemble my paintings." Poirot studied him carefully, noting the tension behind the man's outward composure. Indeed, You were convicted of a murder, one that bore an uncanny resemblance to a canvas you had previously completed. And now, years later, new crimes have emerged. Crimes that mirror other works of yours currently on display at the Stanton Gallery. Surely this cannot be coincidence? Leclerc gave a soft, bitter laugh. My art follows me like a shadow. Even in here, it haunts me. He pressed a hand lightly to his temple, as though warding off a painful memory. I painted those pieces long ago, portraits of emotion, obsession, sorrow. They were never meant to become real. Poirot tilted his head, watching closely. There was something in the tone, regret, yes, but also an unmistakable fear. So you claim no involvement? That you have not influenced these events from within these walls? I swear to you, monsieur, Leclerc said quietly. I am guilty of many things, failing my family, trusting the wrong people, perhaps even creating images too dark for the world to understand, but I did not kill my wife, and I have had no contact with anyone beyond this prison. I did not orchestrate these horrors. Silence settled between them, broken only by a faint scrape in the corridor, another guard pacing, always watching. Poirot leaned forward, voice low. You speak of your innocence, yet the court found otherwise. I know what the court decided. Leclerc's voice hardened momentarily before softening again. But I am telling you the truth. I did not murder her. And these new crimes, they are as terrifying to me as they are to you. Poirot paused, considering how best to shift the conversation. Let us turn, then, to your family. You have 2 children, Thomas and Viola. For the first time, something softened Leclerc's features. A flicker of light in the ruins. Yes, my son and daughter. I have not seen them in over 15 years. They were just children when... His voice caught. When everything fell apart. Have they ever visited? Written? Leclerc shook his head. Number, not a letter, not a whisper. After the trial days, they vanished from my life. I believe they inherited the house after my conviction, but I don't know if they remained. I've heard rumors that it stood empty or was sold, but in truth I have no idea where they are. Poirot regarded him silently for a long moment. The paintings at the Stanton Gallery, monsieur, 4 of them, striking in their emotional resonance and disturbing familiarity. You claim they were painted long ago? Yes, Leclerc replied. Most of them were part of a private collection, never meant to be shown again. And yet they are, displayed under the patronage of an anonymous benefactor. How did they find their way into the world once more? That is the question, isn't it? Leclerc muttered. If someone purchased them, or gained access, it was done without my consent. I knew nothing of this exhibit until the prison chaplain mentioned it, almost in passing. Poirot narrowed his eyes slightly. And does it not trouble you that someone is recreating your visions, turning symbols of love and loss into instruments of murder? Leclerc's voice cracked as he answered. It horrifies me, the idea that someone has twisted my work into a blueprint for violence. I cannot bear it. Believe me, Monsieur Poirot, if I had any way to stop this, any power, I would. There was pain in his eyes, Poirot thought. But pain alone was not proof. He let a silence stretch between them before speaking again. I do not believe you approve of these acts. That much seems evident, Poirot said softly. But that does not mean you are unconnected. I believe the truth may lie not within this prison, but beyond it. Perhaps with someone who still feels bound to your legacy. Leclerc blinked slowly. You think, my children? He asked, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. You believe they are involved? I do not believe, not yet, but I suspect. And I intend to find out, Poirot replied. I will begin with the old family home. The sound of a guard's footsteps signaled the end of their meeting. Leclerc rose slowly, his movements fatigued. I fear what you'll find, he murmured. But thank you for listening, Monsieur Poirot. Few have bothered to ask. Poirot nodded gravely and stepped out into the corridor once more, his footsteps swallowed by the dull acoustics of the prison. As he exited Lime Bridge, the sunlight on the iron gates was dazzling. He stood for a moment, letting the winter air clear his mind. The meeting had not brought answers, but it had brought clarity. Leclerc was a man broken by the past, perhaps unjustly condemned. But the danger now was not in what he had done, but in what someone else was doing in his name. The key to this mystery did not lie in prison. It lay in the shadows of a forgotten family home. Chapter 7. The House That Watched. Hercule Poirot stepped out of the hired motor car, his sharp eyes scanning the wind-swept road ahead. Before him stood the Leclerc house, once perhaps a place of warmth and artistry, now reduced to a crumbling relic beneath a grey, cloud-choked sky. The air was cold and restless, rattling the skeletal trees and moaning through broken window panes. The house loomed at the end of the gravel drive like a forgotten monument, weary with secrets. Beside him, Chief Inspector Giles tugged his coat tighter against the chill. Behind them, 2 constables followed in silence, their boots crunching against the frosty gravel. "Not exactly welcoming," Giles muttered, nodding at a loose shutter banging softly against the siding. Poirot offered a faint smile, but his gaze remained fixed on the house. "It is not warmth we seek, mon ami. It is truth, and I believe it resides within these walls." Though time and decay had taken their toll, the house still bore traces of what it had once been. A home, a sanctuary, a studio. Maurice Leclerc's home. As Poirot approached the front door, he felt the subtle press of intuition, a whisper from the past warning him that the story was not finished. Inside, the air was thick with dust and damp. A scent of mildew and disuse lingered in the narrow hallway where wallpaper peeled from the walls like shedding skin. Every floorboard creaked beneath their steps. The constables glanced around warily, their faces marked by quiet apprehension. Poirot led the way to the studio, the heart of the house, and, he suspected, the heart of the mystery. The room was large but suffocating in its gloom. A single narrow window admitted the faintest light, casting long shadows across a cluttered space. Easels leaned drunkenly against the walls, mold-spotted canvases slumped in piles. A splintered work table was strewn with half-finished sketches and dried paint jars. "It's like time stopped here," Giles said, brushing a layer of dust from a stool. As if Leclerc walked out and never looked back. Poirot moved slowly, methodically, eyes sweeping across every detail. And yet, not everything here is old. He bent to retrieve a crumpled sheet of paper near the table. It bore a pencil sketch of 2 entwined figures, the pose unmistakably similar to the second murder scene. Poirot's pulse quickened. This was no forgotten relic. This was recent. He stepped deeper into the room, pausing by a sagging workbench. Rusted knives lay scattered across the surface, the metal orange with age, but not ancient. More alarming was the open chest nearby, filled with thick spools of thread, some of it still clean, vivid, almost new. Poirot picked one up, inspecting its texture and hue. It was identical to the thread used in the recent murders. "These materials," he murmured, holding the spool up to the light, "do not belong in an abandoned house." Giles frowned, moving closer. "You think someone's been using this place as a base?" "I do not think it, Inspector. I know it. These threads, these sketches, they are too carefully chosen. Someone has returned to this house, not just to remember, but to recreate. Across the far wall, a patch of wallpaper had been cleared to expose crude sketches pinned in a macabre row. Each one depicted a tableau lifted directly from the murder scenes, lovers stitched together, lips sewn in eternal silence, bodies arranged with theatrical precision. A chill slid down Poirot's spine. "This is not only inspiration," he said quietly, "it is rehearsal." Then came the sound, a groan, barely audible, but but unmistakable. A floorboard above them. Poirot froze. His eyes met Giles's in alarm. Until that moment, the house had felt empty, frozen in time. But now, someone was moving. Giles gave a silent signal. The constables straightened, hands hovering near their weapons. Poirot raised a hand to calm them, then gestured toward the narrow staircase that led to the upper floor. Slowly, carefully, they began to climb. The steps groaned beneath their weight. Dust swirled around them like breath held too long. The upper landing was dim and silent, lined with 3 closed doors. 2 were likely bedrooms, the third, at the end, perhaps the attic. The stillness was unnerving, as though the house itself were listening. Poirot approached the first door on the left and turned the handle slowly. It gave without resistance, revealing a small bedroom in disarray. The furniture was sparse, the air thick with neglect. Sketches lay scattered across the bed, and battered suitcases sat open on the floor. One muddy footprint stained the boards near the window. "Someone has been staying here," Giles whispered. Poirot nodded. "Not long ago, perhaps even now." The room pulsed with a strange energy, an unfinished narrative, poised at its climax. Somewhere in this house a person remained. Whether fugitive or spectre, it was clear. The truth was close. Poirot returned to the hallway. The second door waited. His heartbeat slowed with deliberate discipline, though tension knotted in his chest. There were answers behind that door, of that he was certain. But there was also danger. Whoever had resurrected Maurice Leclerc's twisted visions was not merely imitating the past. They were perfecting it. With a steady hand, Poirot reached for the handle. Chapter 8. Portrait of the Guilty. The attic of the Leclerc house was choked with silence and dust. A single bare bulb swung overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow that deepened every shadow. Beneath its flickering light stood Hercule Poirot, flanked by Inspector Giles and 2 constables. The air was stale with age and the scent of turpentine and forgotten canvases, an atmosphere ripe with dread. Here, at the top of the ruined house, the final truths waited to be unearthed. In the center of the room stood Thomas and Viola Leclerc. They faced the investigators in silence, their features lit in half-tones by the dim bulb. Thomas, tall and angular, exuded a cold stillness. Viola clutched at the fraying edge of her coat, but her eyes held an eerie composure. Shock at the intrusion had quickly dissolved into something quieter, something unsettling. Inspector Giles broke the silence with a voice that was steady but taut. "Thomas Leclerc, Viola Leclerc, we need answers. There is strong reason to believe—" He faltered, as though reluctant to voice the horror of what they suspected. Thomas spoke first, his voice smooth and dispassionate. "You're here about the murders." Poirot stepped forward, his tone measured, his gaze unblinking. "Oui, monsieur. Unusual murders, crimes arranged with great care, as if they were compositions, and each one bears the signature of your late father's work." A tension pulsed through the attic as his words hung in the air. The siblings exchanged a look, quiet, knowing. Viola stepped forward, her voice soft and hauntingly serene. "We've always known about Father's paintings." He saw what others didn't. His work captured possibility. The space seemed to contract, the walls leaning inward with the weight of her words. Around them, portfolios and drawings were scattered like relics. Many bore signs of tampering, sketches once innocent, now rendered grotesque by new, darker embellishments. Poirot scanned the room and saw not just remnants of art, but echoes of violence given form. Giles hardened his tone. "This is more than obsession. We believe you've used these paintings, your father's visions, as blueprints for murder." Viola's lips curled into a ghost of a smile. Thomas remained unmoved, arms folded like a man defending not himself, but an ideal. "We didn't create the vision," she said quietly. "We simply finished it." Thomas nodded, eyes dark with memory. Mother hated Father's art. She hated us. Always shouting, always forcing us into the roles she had chosen. But Father's paintings, those were the only places we were ever seen. Truly seen. Poirot's voice was gentle, but insistent. And so, you killed her. There was no hesitation. Viola gave the smallest of nods. We used the knife from his painting, The Forsaken Muse, drove it into her chest just as Father had drawn it. He never knew. He was asleep or distracted. It hardly mattered. The blunt admission drew a sharp breath from one of the constables. Poirot, despite years of experience, felt the cold fingers of revulsion trace his spine. He had dealt with killers of every kind, but this was different. This was not simply murder, it was ideology made flesh. Your father was imprisoned, Poirot said softly. He paid for your crime. Thomas let out a quiet, mirthless laugh. We were children, no one would suspect us. We stayed silent, and when Father went to prison, the world moved on. Viola stepped beside him, her voice reverent. We grew. We studied his art over and over. Each canvas was more than paint, it was a guide, a story waiting to be completed. So we created our own versions, living tableau of love, pain, and truth. Truth? Giles snapped. You murdered innocents. Thomas's tone deepened into fervor. They weren't random. Each couple, each bond, they represented something. The kiss, the embrace, the twin forms. We reimagined them. Thread, rope, flesh. The canvas became the body. Poirot stood perfectly still. His face, so often inscrutable, now bore a trace of sorrow. No, he said, you did not create truth. You distorted beauty into cruelty. You took a father's dreams and turned them into nightmares. For the first time, Viola's poise faltered. Her lips trembled, and her eyes blinked rapidly. We didn't mean for him to suffer, Father. He was our muse. After Mother died, something changed in us. The world seemed clearer, sharper. The lines between real and imagined blurred. Inspector Giles raised a hand, signaling the constables. The handcuffs gleamed in the dim light. Thomas and Viola didn't move. They stood quietly as the officers approached, as though their performance was done, and the curtain had finally fallen. Poirot watched, heart heavy, as the siblings submitted without resistance. There was no defiance in them, only a haunting stillness, as though they believed themselves misunderstood artists rather than murderers. The room around them was a testament to that delusion, every sketch, every canvas, soaked in madness disguised as method. As they were led toward the stairs, Poirot addressed them one last time. Your father will be freed. The truth will absolve him, though it cannot restore what you destroyed. Thomas paused and looked over his shoulder. We gave life to his art, he said with calm finality. We did what he never dared. Poirot did not respond. He simply watched them disappear down the stairwell, their footsteps muffled by the floorboards worn by grief and guilt. Left alone, Poirot turned once more to the remnants of Maurice Leclerc's legacy. The sketches bore no answers, only evidence of how far imagination could descend into madness. In his long career, he had met killers driven by vengeance, greed, and jealousy, but never had he encountered a crime born of such twisted reverence, of creativity transformed into ritual. As he stepped out into the cold night, Poirot felt no triumph. There was truth, yes, but no victory. The Leclerc legacy had begun with a brushstroke and ended in blood.